going to try to go back to Eric if you're there. Can you hear us now?
Hello, good afternoon.
Wonderful. Lovely to hear you as well as see you alive on the chat. Over to you.
Very good, thank you, and good day, everyone. It's a pleasure to attend your event. I'll try to bring the perspective of a let's say a scientist working at ESA, my agency, and to explain a little bit how we're going to give access to the data generated by my experiment or the experiment of other scientists. Give a little bit the context of the rights that I have about this data, the data of others, and so on. I would like to ask if you can actually just display my slides. Very good. And since I cannot take control of my slides, I will politely ask you, kindly ask you to flip the slides. My first slide is providing a little bit the context of ESA. I'm not going to go into all the details, but ESA is an international organization. We have different member states composing ESA, and ESA is operating different aspects of strategy, budget allocations, selection of science, developing hardware for different missions, for different destinations. We define the science with the broad scientific community, can be applied or fundamental research. Once we have the hardware, we go into a mission operation phase. We operate on many different platforms along different time frames, and we generate data and samples in general. When the mission is over, the data is basically entering the exploitation phase, and it starts with first the dissemination of this data to our prime customers, the scientists, the research customers, as I will call them. They perform analysis of these results of this data, and hopefully they publish, and we can declare the completion of their project, and they come back with new ideas, new projects to be selected, and so on and so forth. The purpose of this short pitch is actually to concentrate on one branch of this, as for my next slide. So we're going to concentrate on this part highlighted in yellow. So I'm not at all talking about how we organize the missions. Neither do I talk about how the operations are performed at ESA, but rather when the data is available on ground, how we distribute it, and how we exploit this data. Next slide, please. So we have a data policy, and this data policy has recently been updated in such a way that we can envisage future exploration destination in our directorate, the Directorate of Human and Robotics Exploration. And this policy is applicable for all the research platforms that we are operating. Essentially, in the HRE Directorate, we operate a lot of platforms that deal with weightlessness conditions, and we cover a broad range of scientific disciplines, ranging from physical science, biology, human physiology. Yes, we do have humans in the loop when we collect data. And this data policy is also applicable for future destination, Moon and Mars. We are busy preparing that as you are for the Moon. This data policy is also applicable for all activities that we sponsor. Definitely, we want to implement a systematic archiving process, and I would like actually to echo a bit what the presenter, Gabriel Swaine, put in place. The concept of, or the principle of transparency and sharing of scientific data is at the essence of this data policy. One limitation, though, we are not handling samples. Of course, if we generate samples, be them from human test subjects, from biological samples, or later on, if we bring some moon rocks, for example, this archiving will not handle the samples. The samples will be handed over to our researchers. However, we're going to ask them to characterize these samples following standard methodologies. And this electronic data about the sample will also join this archiving scheme. We are also distinguishing the type of data that we are manipulating. ESA, in the context of its mission and activities implemented, is owning what we call the raw and calibrated data. I'll take the example of some temperature measurements that are performed with a system, with an experimental device. If we have calibration of temperature sensors, the calibration will be taken into account, and ESA owns this data, and therefore we're going to make this data, we're going to administer this data and make it public. The distinction between the other type of data of utmost importance is what we call the process data. This one is not owned by the agency, but rather by the researchers, resulting from their intellectual work. So that's what we call the post-flight analysis, and that involves their brain, their research capabilities, their scientific cooperation. The official dissemination of all the electronic data sets in our system is taking place shortly after the end of the operational phase. So we wait until the operations are finished before we organize this data on our archiving scheme. That means that scientists are getting a peek or a preview of their data during the mission when they interface with my colleagues responsible for this phase of their project implementation. But the official delivery of the data occurs after the operational phase. Next slide, please. So the access to these data sets follow a logic that is common to several directorates at ESA. We have archive platforms that are usually operated from Spain at the premises, one of the center of ESA. And so we control completely what we do with this data and how we structure the archives. So the archives include not only the data set, but all the metadata about those data sets. Metadata is essential to retrieve information, cross-study some data sets, compare them between missions and so on. So without metadata, the data is actually not very useful in practice. We are protecting the researchers that are doing business with us. And here I'm ranging from, let's say, academia or private research centers or even customers of other nature with an exclusivity period, meaning they get the right to have access to the data we organize shortly after the operation phase, typically for 6 months. So no one else at first has access to this data. So they retrieve the data and they start their post-flight analysis. Doing so, they are generating processed data and they are hopefully publishing their scientific results. Of important note, and that's something that is different, for example, with how NASA handles the researchers, we don't have a direct contract with our researchers. It's rather the member states forming ESA that are retaining the prerogative of funding them during their post-flight analysis. So that's also explained why we have absolutely no right, no structural right about the process data that are created during the post-flight analysis. The grants are provided by the member states. We fully respect that. However, the platform the archiving platform that we have in place is able, of course, to host the process data sets, and I'm going to explain that in the next slide. So when the exclusivity period is over, again, these 6 months is the typical duration. We really want to make sure that the scientists are publishing and are properly funded by our member states to do so. But of course, there might be exceptions depending on the complexity of the analysis. Scientists may request an extension of this exclusivity period, and ESA is going to accept that. So we keep the good relationship with the scientists also after the execution of their experiments, and we make sure that they are not completely spoiled in their analysis and that people start looking at their data before they publish themselves. So the raw and calibrated data after the exclusivity period, whenever it comes, is turned public to the maximum extent. And why am I putting this in brackets? This is not going to be impacting, let's say, moon rocks or information about moon rocks, but when we have humans in the loop, basically the astronauts that are participating to such experiments, they consent for a certain type of protocol being applied on them when we collect data. And therefore, their data is not accessible for whatever science comes after when the data is accessed by other scientists. There is a procedure existing to give access to this personally identifiable data, the data from the astronaut. But this is the only exception where the raw and calibrated data is not turned automatically public in our system, only when you have human in the loop. The system is such that we can also host the process data. Researchers may want to provide back these data sets to the agency. And in that case, we don't get rights to those data, but we host this data next to the raw and calibrated data of the same experiment. We credit the scientist via the digital object identifiers assigned to these data collections, to these data sets, meaning that ESA commits that for a very long period, and I'll come to that in a moment, a very long period, these data sets are going to be tagged via DOIs with the credit of the scientist. Similarly, raw and calibrated data are also characterized with DOIs that are created by and referenced with ESA. The data sets, the process data sets, should they be stored in our system, are to be open to, let's say, other scientists, other entities, including commercial entities. We will never turn a data set public without having the authorization of a process data set public without having the authorization of the researchers. So they maintain ownership of the process data sets. There are examples where we have process data sets, and after publication, the scientists have said, listen, you can give access to those data to other scientists. They might find our study interesting. And we reference also the scientific publication and so on. It's a very fair organization with respect to the researchers. Next slide. So in a nutshell, what we try to implement with this is not only the dissemination, an organized dissemination of the data, respecting an exclusivity period, ensuring that all the people involved in the experiment receive the same information. So the data sharing plan per investigation is very clear. Everybody has the same right at ESA. We also guarantee a long-term preservation for a period of 30 years. It comes with challenges. That means that we need to make sure that the data sets are stored in a persistent and open format. There is nothing exotic that is going to be read only with an operating system that will not be running in 10 years from now. The data sets are also tagged with DOIs. So DOIs are permanent link that tag forever these data sets with a landing page explaining what the data set is about and to whom it belongs to. And our directorate is also taking care of the IT archiving obsolescence. It turns out that such an archiving system is continuously reworked, modernized over cycles of 5 years, I would say. So there is a cost associated to that, and we operate that like the rest of our program with the money that our member states is giving us. Next slide. I'd like to mention in the context of your conference, the modus operandi for commercial activities. We have a few commercial activities, and I think some of my colleagues proposed that during this week, presented that. So commercial partnerships with our agency are possible. They are regulated via agreements that are accepted by our member states. But in the case of purely commercial activities, when there is no partnership and sharing, a purely commercial experiment is also possible. We have implemented a few of those. In that case, ESA even does not own the raw and calibrated data. We do not own this data, and therefore this data never enters our archiving system. It's the only exception where we don't have this obligation as an international organization to handle this data, the data generated for those missions. In the case of a commercial agent, a commercial experiment, data sets and samples are delivered directly to the commercial customer at the end of the operation phase, and we don't see it. Now, if this commercial entity would come to ESA and say, can you actually store the data? We can, of course, do that. They have done business with us. There will be only one condition. The data will need to a certain level to be put open on the archiving system. We will only archive data that can actually be released to third parties, to entities, to other scientists, academia, or even centers that are privately organizing research and development activities. That's also fine. So this is the only exception about our archiving for commercial activities. Next slide. So in conclusion, we are trying to do our very best to embrace the wave of big data, open access, free access. This is completely in the mandate of our international organization. What we are trying to do is to handle the knowledge that is created by all our activities for the benefit of not only our customers, but also, let's say, the general public, additional scientists, and they don't need to be European. There is no boundary there. For disseminating this data. We foster re-exploitation to the maximum extent. The reason why we are also having this 30-year horizon is history shows that revisiting data sometimes after a decade with new analytical capabilities and so on can bring breakthrough. And therefore it's important not only to satisfy the scientists that do directly business with us, the ones that are co-workers in a specific field, but also one or two generations of scientists after them. This system that we have is called the HRE Data Archive. It's active. If you go to my presentation, you will see that there is an hyperlink to it. So the system is live. We have data, and as a public person, you can go to it, simply register, get credentials, and you're going to get access to all the data that has been turned public. It will continue. It's part of, on either side, what we call the infrastructure activities of the organization across several directorates. And so very soon, as part of our exploration program, we will get not only low Earth orbit activities, but Moon and Mars data sets in this system. And with that, I would like to thank you for your time and the opportunity to introduce that concept to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric, and I'm so glad that we could get you online.